Hello, and welcome to the Sailing and Cruising the East Coast of the United States podcast. I'm Bela Musits.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
Hey, Mike, today's guest on the podcast is Dan Kerpelman. Dan was on the podcast a few episodes ago, and we discussed his trip from Rochester to Maine via the St. Lawrence Seaway. And that's a path that not a lot of people take. So it was a really interesting podcast. Well, in this episode, we're going to talk about his trip from Florida to Maine on his new to him sailboat. So Dan purchased a new boat to him, a used boat, but new to him, down in Florida, and then sailed it all the way up to Maine. And so we talked a lot about a bunch of great things about what's involved in that trip and what's involved in getting the boat ready for a trip like that.
Yeah, this sounds great, Bela. And I think listeners, you'll like this episode. Now, I think few of you may ever experience this exact situation that Dan faces, which is getting this really interesting sailboat from a faraway point of purchase to your home port. But look out for some really helpful tips on logistics and processes and equipment and apps, and just a really interesting and meticulously safe approach to bringing home a new boat. And I think there's going to be something for everybody in this episode.
Those are great points, Mike. Now let's dive right into my discussion with Dan. Hi, Dan. Great to see you again. Welcome to the podcast one more time.
Hi, Billy. Good to see you. Good to be back.
Yeah. The first time we chatted on the podcast, you talked about this trip that you took from Rochester, New York, through Lake Ontario, through the St. Lawrence River and the St. Lawrence Seaway, up around Newfoundland and down eventually to Portland, Maine, I think it was.
Exactly.
And now you have another trip that we're going to talk about. So set this one up for us a little bit, Dan.
Sure, Bill. And just to be clear, we didn't make it quite up to Newfoundland. We went around Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Islands. Didn't get quite as far as Newfoundland, just to be precise about that. Yeah, so our original plan after that first loop was to continue on down to New York City the following season, which would have been last summer, and head on up the Hudson, take the mast down, transit the New York canals, and eventually get back to Lake Ontario, which had then been our home port. But once you've experienced the ocean and all it has to offer, our plans changed. We just, we knew every square inch of Lake Ontario by that point, and there just seemed like so much more to discover on the ocean and more vivid experiences and what have you. So we decided to adopt Maine as our new sailing home. And we made another important decision as part of that, which was to change boat. So with somewhat heavy hearts, we put True North up for sale. That was, as a reminder, our Beneteau 41.1, and started the process of seeking our new floating summer home, if you will. And that in of itself was quite a project and quite an adventure. Don't know that we would have time to go through that, but it took us to, I think, 4 different countries. We sailed on some amazing boats and met some amazing people. But to fast forward, we finally settled on an Amel 50. It's the new generation of Amels, who are pretty well known by virtue of the podcast Sailing Delos, which you may have heard of. Yeah, they sailed an older generation Amel ketch called a Super Marimo. And the new generation of Amels are cutter rigged. So this is a 54-foot cutter rig boat. And the reason we wanted to change is, first of all, we wanted a little more space, a little more comfort to offer our guests, more autonomy in terms of fuel, electricity, fresh water, and more of a blue water build, just because there's a lot more going on out there than on the lakes.
Yeah. Speaking of Amel's Super Marabous, and a friend of mine has one, and I helped him sail it from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to Baltimore. And boy, that was a beautiful boat. It was, man, solid. And it has some quirky things about it. After all, it's French. No insult meant to my French brethren, but it's French, and it has a few quirky things. But I understand them, and it was a very, very nice boat. And I believe there's an Amel 50 or 54 in our marina. That is a gorgeous, gorgeous boat. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to understand Amels, you need to understand Henri Amel, the founder of the company, who's really an amazing character. And if you ever read his biography, you'll understand a little bit about some of the rather quirky, as you call them, design choices. The guy was a prisoner of war during World War II 3 times, 2 failed escape attempts, 1 successful. He then joined the French resistance. And in fact, Amel was his secret code name as a member of the resistance, and he liked it, so he adopted it as his name. But probably the most relevant factor that talks to the design of these rather unique boats is that he was blind while designing most of the contemporary Amel models. And therefore, a lot of the design considerations are related to safety, getting around on board when you can't see, which for night sailing is great for the rest of us, and some other factors like that. He also believed in redundancy. You know, there's two of everything. So if something fails, there's an alternative approach. But these are yeah, they're not for everybody. It's kind of an eclectic boat, but the community of owners is tight, very friendly and helpful to each other. It's been a great experience. Now this boat had a lot of this boat, no criticism of Amel, but the boat had sat for way too long. Its prior owner apparently wasn't using it much, and boats, like horses, they need to run, and therefore we had a lot of unfortunate surprises, but nothing major related to the seaworthiness of the boat or how it sailed. It was some of the more, I'll call them comfort features, you know, air conditioning and water maker and some of those sorts of things. But we learned a lot about the new technology to us anyway, and learned how to be fairly self-sufficient and taking care of it all. And a couple of things, you know, we relied on experts for assistance. Yeah. So that was an adventure. The boat was actually in Sausalito, California when we bought it, which is absolutely the worst place to buy a boat if you're intending to use it on the East Coast. And to make matters worse, we didn't quite plan the timing accordingly, but I had a hip replacement in January, so I wasn't able to actually sail it myself around the canal, through the canal. So we actually bit the bullet and paid a shipper to do it. And that was quite a challenge in itself, because most of these carriers that transport yachts are foreign flagged, and therefore they're not allowed to load and unload both within the United States. So they load in Ensenada, Mexico. So we need to get the boat from San Francisco to Ensenada. We hired a captain to do that. That worked out great. Wonderful guy. We found some local caretakers in Ensenada, and all this was done remotely while recovering from hip surgery, who took care of the boat for a week or two and then eventually moved it onto the ship. It was one of these ships that sinks partially. The boats float on, and then divers lift cradles, and the boat floats back up and lifts the boats that are on there. So that was quite interesting. Anyway, fast forward, March 2024, I was able to get around again. So I flew down to Fort Lauderdale and met the ship, and offloaded our new sailboat there. And that started the adventure of sailing from Florida to Maine last summer.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to chat about a little bit is, you know, when you're buying a boat, oftentimes it's not close to your home port, as this was the case.
Case in point. Yeah.
So you buy a boat, and now you have to get it from where it is to your home port. And being sailors, we say, well, we'll sail it. And so in this case, you started in Florida. So one of the things I wanted to understand is, how do you sort of prep a new boat to you to sort of get ready for this big trip, right? It's not a short trip. You're not just going out on the lake for a half hour.
Oh, yeah.
So you have new to you, you're not familiar with the systems. You don't know how it sails. You have all of those challenges, and you're going to embark on a pretty long passage. How did you sort of prep the boat and prep yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bela, and it did take some thought and some practice and some trial and error. So the first thing was I got my hands on as much documentation as I could before even seeing the boat physically, or before actually receiving delivery of the boat physically. And by the way, I had the opportunity to sea trial 3 of the same model boat. So I already had quite a few hours on the water with these boats, with some people that really knew them inside and out. So I learned a lot there, took photos, took copious notes, and then got my hands on as much documentation as possible and I just read everything I could about the different systems, and I was able to convince the moderator of the users group to they're very restrictive about only allowing owners in, but I convinced him I was an owner to be. So I was able to get in the users group early and kind of monitor the traffic there and see, what to expect. And that was helpful, building at least a theoretical basis but that's only part of the equation. The other thing we did, which I would recommend to anybody, especially with a complicated boat, a used boat, and frankly with a new boat too, because as we all know, they have quirks as well and problems to solve, was to hold in Florida for an extensive period of time. So we didn't take the delivery of the boat and head up to Maine the next day. And I spent probably a month, 2 months in Florida with the boat. Now, part of it was just simply to spend the time to do the necessary repairs and maintenance. You never want to, unless you have rock solid documentation, you never want to assume the maintenance was done according to schedule and manufacturer's recommendations. So we assumed nothing, and I had baseline service done on the engine. A lot I could do myself, just having had quite a few years of experience taking care of boats. Some things, I really brought in experts. We touched up the bottom paint. We did a full bottom inspection, prop, shaft, rigging, everything you want to make sure is in good working order. And then the other aspect of holding is to practice and do day sailing with it. And that was a big deal. Not only to learn the new boat, but to learn about some of the conditions that we would meet along the way. So for example, in New England and on the Great Lakes, we don't worry that much about depth. But down south, there's some pretty skinny water. And there are inlets and marinas and anchorages they're simply not accessible. This boat has a 7+ foot draft, not to mention a 73-foot air draft, which also ruled out using the Intracoastal Waterway. But anyway, so at the same time, you become familiar with the vessel, but you also become familiar with some of the cruising grounds you'll be encountering on the way. So, we learned to be very careful with tides and currents and fixed bridges and inlets when the wind is opposing the current, and so forth. We also learned that many of the marinas, at least in Florida, they're actually rivers just inside the inlet. And between river current and tidal current, there could be some pretty aggressive tides. And we discovered the hard way that some marinas are simply unapproachable during high tide or during ebb or flow tides and can only be approached at slack tide. Things like that.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So what were some of the specific things? Can you mention maybe 2 or 3 that were really important and maybe you're really glad that you did from a maintenance or learning systems perspective or checking things?
Well, the most important, obviously, I'd say in this order, is the engine. I mean,
Mhm.
you can have great sailing capability, but if you can't get in and out of tight spots in marinas, so the engine was critical. Obviously, the rigging was high on the list. On this particular vessel, the bow thruster was very important. This is a split rudder design. So you don't have the typical prop wash to back and fill for tight maneuvering, and therefore the bow thruster is really important. I hate to say that. I hate to be dependent on a bow thruster as a purist. At least I used to be a purist about sailing. But make sure that all works. All your furling gear, your running rigging, check lines, etc. I think were the most important. Next is instrumentation, chart plotter, radar, all those things that are important if you're out at night or ultimately when you get back to New England, the fog and the lobster traps and what have you. And we had many, many issues. We had the first day we moved the boat 100 miles from Port Canaveral, where the ship dropped it off, to Fort Pierce, where we were having some of the maintenance and service done. And a half hour underway, the depth sounder stopped working. And of course, I told you, Amel's have redundant everything. Well, both depth sounders stopped working. So here we are having to navigate into a shallow channel, ebbing tide, after dark, and no depth sounder. So quickly, we took care of that as a high priority item, and so forth. So I would say those are the top ones: engine,
Yeah.
rigging, and instrumentation. Of course, you want to do your safety check relative to fire extinguishers and flares and signals and what have you as well. But that goes without saying.
Yeah. So speaking of safety, what were some of a couple questions? Do you have a life raft, and do you have jack lines?
Yes and yes. There is a life raft. And jack lines optionally, they can be set or stowed as you like. The boat's very safe. I mean, it's 42,000 pounds. It's stable, it's stately. It has, one of Henri Amel's design choices with his eyesight issue was solid rails as opposed to lifelines. So
Yes.
there's really good protection on board. And, the other thing about it is it's a center cockpit boat, which was a first for us. So when you're sailing, and it's enclosed, it has a hard top and a wraparound windscreen. So that was something we had quite a bit of pause about before making a decision to buy it, because, it almost feels like you're sailing a motor yacht.
Yes.
And for sailors, that's a cardinal sin, of course. No, saying that tongue in cheek. You don't have the same feel, but it's very safe. You're not right on the hairy edge of the
Right.
peeling deck and hanging on for dear life. You're snug in a cabin effectively. But I would say, this boat was super well equipped. I mean, everything related to safety. It had an EPIRB. It had all the things you asked about, life raft and what have you, and the John Boy man overboard retrieval system, and so many things. I mean, I didn't even know how half the stuff worked. I had to read the manuals to understand it.
So I have a question for you. I'm always curious, how do you rig your jack lines?
Well, I've always attached them to the bow cleat on on either side, run them along the side deck and attach them to a stern cleat.
Yeah.
The cleats are really solid, and they're usually lined up such that the jack line runs freely from bow to stern.
Yeah.
Is that how you do it?
It's not, and here's the thinking, and I suggest people try this experiment. Sometime when you're out anchored, set up your jack lines like you set them up, and jump overboard and see if you can get back on the boat. And I can't get back on my boat if I fall overboard. So unless, I mean, if the boat's underway, there's no way I can get back. Right.
Yeah.
So I rig my jack lines. I actually go from the bow cleat to the mast, to the base of the mast, and then from the base of the mast back to a cleat near the stern of the boat.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And my harness lines are short enough that I can still maneuver, but I can't fall overboard.
That's a really great idea. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Assuming you can reach everything you need to reach.
Yeah. So and I have two lines, harness lines. So I clip one, unclip the other.
Yeah.
And
the
one is
tether.
Yes, and one is a little longer than the other, so I'm conscious about that. But that's the thing that was sort of eye-opening to me on my boat. I have a high freeboard on my boat. I think as you do.
Oh, yeah.
It's a long way down. And
yeah, it is.
And there's just no way I could get, now maybe if I was 22 years old and a Navy SEAL, I could figure out how to get back on my boat, but neither of those things are true.
A safety boarding ladder?
Well, I have a stern, a sugar scoop stern, so I can, but I can't get to the problem was I couldn't get to the stern of the boat when I was clipped in, tethered.
Right, that makes sense.
Right, I couldn't get back there.
You raised some really good points. Yeah. Our safety ladders are stern as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I have a sugar scoop, kind of stern with the safety ladder in the back, and when the lifeline is on the stern cleat, I couldn't get back to my ladder.
Right.
So, yeah. Anyway, just some food for thought. I tried to ask people that question because to see how different people do it, because as you know, everyone has oftentimes, because of the design of the boat or something, has their way of doing things, and I try to learn.
Yeah, of course. No, I think your way makes sense. And I've always thought of jack lines as keeping the person close to the boat, not necessarily as a boarding technique. If you're solo, you need to be able to get back on board while the boat's underway because you're presumably under autopilot screaming along. If there's crew, I think the goal is just to keep you near the boat till the boat can be
But
stopped.
at 2 o'clock at night, if I fall overboard, and particularly if
you're on a solo watch and it's noisy outside. No one's
You're on a solo watch, it's breezy outside, or you're motoring, people are not going to hear you.
Right.
So anyway, the other question I had for you is what sort of tools do you use for sort of planning the passage? What weather tools do you use? Do you have any other sort of favorite chart books or things that you use for that kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, we use cruising guides. They tend to be more about, at least regarding the East Coast, they tend to be more about the intracoastal waterway. So they don't offer much help in terms of the passages themselves, but the inlets are common between ICW and open ocean. So that was somewhat useful. And then, we use probably the apps that most sailors use. We like the Navionics boating app. I discovered Aquamap this year, which is quite nice.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the latter part of the season, I like to plot with those apps because they offer all kinds of semi-automated idea suggestions and what have you. And our main chart plotter, of course, we have 2 chart plotters, 2 different brands on board, thanks to Henri's propensity for redundancy. But there's no automated routing assisted. There's no assisted routing, so it was kind of tedious to either plot directly on that or to plot in an automated fashion on the apps and then manually transcribe, making all kinds of mistakes, of course.
Yeah.
But then I discovered that Furuno has a companion app, which we started using, where it offers, it's called TZ iBoat, awkward name, but it offers, assisted plotting, and then it can be connected directly through Wi-Fi to the chart plotter and your plot is uploaded. So that's kind of become our go-to for plotting. Weather, we use Windfinder, Windy, Climb, which is a animated radar app, which is a go-to app for us. We use marine traffic to see where boats are and to see if boats can see us because we can't see ourselves on our own chart plotter.
Right.
Although that's not entirely reliable. What else do we use? We use Nebo, which is a really nice automated logging system, if you've heard of that.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
And that's great. Not only to comply with the legal requirement to maintain a log, but if you're blogging like we were, it's a nice way to show progress, maps, and all that. So that was a really nice little investment.
Right.
What else? And then there's some apps that are captive to different pieces of equipment. So you have apps that allow you to check your battery monitor, or apps that give you status of different pieces of equipment on board. So we use those a lot. Anchor alerts, tidal charts.
Yeah.
Those are.
And did you hire a weather router? Did someone help you do the planning?
We did. We hired Chris Parker. We subscribed to his service just to try it. And in the end, we bought, I think, credit for 10 customized routes, and we only used it twice in the end. I think we got more confident as we went along, and we found that, that if you use a couple of different weather apps and good charts, you can make too. But it was a nice sort of sanity check. I would typically do the plan myself, and then I'd ask Chris's team for a custom routing and see how well or badly we did.
Yeah.
Usually they just agreed with us, said, yeah, it makes sense. Go ahead.
Yeah. And excuse me, did you do this nonstop or did you stop along the way?
No, because we really wanted to explore.
Yeah.
Being sort of dyed in the wool Northeastern Yankee types, we didn't know much about the South other than quick business stops over my career. So we made it a 4-month trip. I mean, we could have done it probably in a few weeks.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And we stopped. We tried to minimize overnighters as well. Just because it's a lot more comfortable and fun. Although the couple of overnighters we did were really amazing as well, so I don't regret them at all. But for that reason, and for the reason of wanting to sightsee and meet people and get to know a part of our country we really didn't know very well, we decided to stop a lot. And we had friends or family that would show up for a few days at a time. So needless to say, we needed to be on land to fetch them and drop them off.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of the great things about, the East Coast is that you can go from basically Houston, Texas, all the way up to northern part of Maine. And you don't have to you can get away with maybe just 1 or 2 overnights at the most,
Yeah. Yeah. The Outer Banks.
Yes.
And getting up the coast of New Jersey on the outside.
New Jersey.
Not quite that's more, I think we did a 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. departure because we always like to arrive in unknown places or complicated places during daylight if possible.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Yeah,
So what were a couple of your favorite spots to stop?
Well, all of them. No, that's not fair. One was more amazing than the next, or the last. We really liked Charleston, South Carolina, as a city, and the harbor there with its Civil War history, and there's a lot of history there, and it's just a attractive town with nice people. So we certainly enjoyed that. We weren't crazy about Florida, other than Fernandina Beach. I'm backing up a little bit, which is kind of different than your typical Florida town. It was nice, and we popped over to Cumberland Island, Georgia, with which has some really interesting hiking. We love some of the secluded anchorages along the way that are off the beaten track, and we enjoyed that because we were in total isolation. It's a little intimidating the first couple of times, but also amazing in the quiet, the star views, and we saw a tremendous amount of wildlife. Dolphins, sea turtles, jellyfish, etc. We actually anchored one night off. This was in the news recently. There's an island I think it's in Georgia still, that's called Morgan Island, and it's the home to a bunch of retired laboratory monkeys, and they all escaped recently. You may have heard that in the news about a month ago.
No.
It was a big story. Yeah, it made it to most of the news media. Anyway, we anchored about 100 yards offshore, and we heard monkeys at night. It was kind of
wow.
Let's see. We really enjoyed North Carolina. Many places in North Carolina, starting with Bald Head Island at the mouth of the Cape Fear River. Just beautiful beaches and lovely place. We weren't too crazy about Hilton Head, South Carolina. It was a great place if you're in the golf resorts and crowded beaches, but we like more of the natural setting. Wrightsville Beach was a big surprise.
Yes, we've been there.
Yeah.
Yep.
It looks like it's right out of a 1950s Annette Funicello beach movie, right? But
excellent analogy. Excellent description.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. But it was fun. It was sort of a throwback, and we met some really nice people. I mean, we made what I think are going to be lifelong friends, and really you can't get to know a region unless you get to know some of the people in and from that region. And we met some really interesting local people, just the nicest folks, smart. We had our Yankee versus Southerner differences, but it was all very civilized, constructive conversation, which is critical in a democracy. So that was a favorite. We loved Beaufort, North Carolina as well. And in particular, the Cape Lookout Bight, which is a little bit of an enclosed bay right at the southern part of the Outer Banks, where we sat and staged our Outer Banks rounding because we wanted to pick the right weather window.
Right.
Yeah, and the beaches are beautiful. The water is clean and it's great swimming and fishing. Just had a good old time in North Carolina. And then, of course, we weren't too crazy about the Mid-Atlantic. We thought the Chesapeake was going to be amazing. Everyone rants and raves about it. Honestly, it didn't do much for us. And I don't mean to be critical of a space that I know many people appreciate. It's very personal. Of course, sailing into New York City is an experience that nobody will ever forget. No matter how many times you've been to New York City by plane, car, train, or whatever, it's just an amazing thing. We loved Mystic, Connecticut.
Oh yeah.
Martha's
Yep.
Vineyard and Nantucket were favorites. Portsmouth, New Hampshire was a favorite. And then, of course, back to good old home of Maine. We still love the place. We found some beautiful anchorages we didn't know previously on the Penobscot, in the Penobscot Bay Peninsula archipelago.
Yeah.
We always loved Booth Bay Harbor. We love Camden, but we covered those last year, so that's a better part. So
Very nice.
Yeah, you asked for the top couple. I think I gave you many more than that, but they were all fascinating for different reasons.
It is amazing how you can be out in the middle of nowhere, or you think you're out in the middle of nowhere. You're in a very secluded anchorage, and you can sail 5 miles in one direction, and you're like in a big city. It's just like remarkable to me.
It really is. And Bill, although it wasn't a stop technically, I'd be remiss not to mention our rounding of the Outer Banks, because that was probably one of the most fascinating and fun sailing experiences we had. So if you allow me just a second on that.
Yeah, sure.
So that's a 230-mile stretch between Beaufort, North Carolina and Norfolk, Virginia, the entrance of the Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah.
So needless to say, it was an overnighter and then some. And of course, being called the graveyard of the Atlantic, we were all intimidated before setting out. We very carefully picked a weather window. So we had following winds, we had a full moon and reasonable seas. So the conditions were perfect. And we were far enough offshore that we got some Gulf Stream current. The interesting thing about the Gulf Stream, and this was a surprise to me, is it's also the deepest blue water I've ever seen. Oceans, all the poetry says they're blue. They're really gray most of the time.
Yes.
But when we got out into the Gulf Stream, it was this deep, beautiful blue, and the sun rays would pierce the surface. The other thing is we had a stowaway, so to speak, during that rounding. So this friend of ours we met in North Carolina at Wrightsville Beach had us for dinner one night, and he said, if you're looking for some crew, I would love to go around the Outer Banks with y'all. And we thought, well, why not? An extra pair of hands, nice person.
Sure.
So he came along, and he's a big time fisherman, and he knew those waters like nobody's business. And he told us, when we get out far enough that we cross the 100-foot depth line, we might see some flying fish. Well, when we hit 99.8 feet of depth, out of nowhere came school after school of flying fish skimming across the surface. They made me think of hummingbirds, actually. That's what they look like when they're flying, the wings flapping. But anyway, that was really fun to watch. Saw some more dolphins and so
yeah.
But the full moon, and we had the spinnaker flying the whole way. The asymmetrical spinnaker flying the whole way. So it was a beautiful sail. Not to mention the scenery and the water and the wildlife. Anyway, that's the parentheses I wanted to open about that and close.
Yeah, there is something magical about sailing at night. At least for me, there is. Being on that 2 o'clock in the morning watch, and if conditions are nice and the full moon, it really is. There's just something magical and mystical, and just it's. I've gone camping many times, right? But it's not the same as, laying on your back, looking up at the stars at night when you're on a boat out in the middle of the ocean someplace and there's nothing else around. There's just something mystical about it.
You're so right. And I take it you've done your share of night sailing.
Yeah, I've done several overnights. I'd like to do more, but I've done several, and it really is interesting. And then the flying fish reminded me, on a couple of trips I've done, in the morning, we'd always find a few on deck. And
right.
they'd be succumbed, of course, and we'd throw them overboard. But somehow at night they'd end up on deck somehow. They could fly high enough to get on the boat.
Right.
Oh, another question I had for you. Did you have AIS on your boat?
Yes. Both, we had a transponder, so we receive and broadcast AIS.
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing to do for long distance cruising, although you can never rely on it because, as you know, it's optional for pleasure craft. In Maine anyway, lobster boats never have it.
Yeah.
Or at least we've never experienced that. And, it's not always real time. So it's a good complement to radar, but I would never rely on it alone.
Right. Right. Yeah, I find I have it on my boat. I added it a number of years ago, and it's great. But you're right. You can't assume that everyone's on it, because they're not. And I have found that most fishing boats that I run across, even ones that are dragging nets and stuff, it's not turned on.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'm not sure
you
if
know.
they're exempt from the requirement of the Class A requirement, or they just choose to ignore the requirement.
Right. Right. So another question I have for you: have a long passage like this, how do you, and you talked about the stowaway, so this is good. So how do you sort of think about who you allow to come on a trip like this or not, right? I mean, because you want to be a little careful. You want to have people who have some experience, because you don't want someone who's going to have an awful experience and be sick, or, getting seasick and stuff. So I always like to ask people how they sort of select crew.
We don't. Sorry, that stowaway, between quotes, was a rare exception. We did it. The real long passages, it was just the two of us the whole time.
Got it.
So when we had guests, we would typically day sail from a port. So for example, we spent some time in Annapolis, and we'd sail out to St. Michael's Island, spend the night,
Yes.
bring them back. So we weren't reliant or dependent on our guests as crew, and therefore they could participate as much or as little as they wished. But for the serious sailing, it was Sandy and me, and that was it.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
That said, if we were to have crew, to your point, you need to vet them extremely well. What kind of experience do they have? And it's not just about how good of a sailor they are, but are you
That's
willing
right.
to spend all that quality time with those individuals, and be
right.
compatible and not get on each other's nerves? I've heard some real horror stories about that not going well.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I've heard those horror stories as well. Luckily, I've never experienced a horror story, so I'm appreciative of that for all the people I've sailed with. So if it was just the two of you on a long passage like the Outer Banks, how did you do watches?
We did 2 on, 2 off, and I would always, having a little more experience than Sandy, I would always rest on a bunk that, well, it wasn't a bunk, on the dinette that was in clear line of sight to the cockpit and earshot away, so she could call me, or if the conditions allowed, right in the cockpit. It's a really nice bench with cushion in the cockpit, and it's covered and protected, so it was, semi watch, but that's how we did it. And 2 hours is a little short, you might argue, but for us it just seemed to be a good rhythm.
Yeah. I'm always interested and curious. Different people do it different ways, and you got to figure out what sort of works for you and your rhythm. And different people need different amounts of sleep. One of the things that I've always done is we set up a watch schedule. I set it up, whether there's 2 people or 4 people or 3 people, I set it up for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or however many number of days it's going to be. So even during the day, there's a watch schedule.
Yeah,
so
that makes a lot of sense.
So that people know. Lots of times when a couple trips I've done, I've had 3-person crews, total of 3 people, so that even during the day, if you didn't get good sleep last night, that you could go sleep for these 3 hours.
That makes a lot of sense.
And you
like
didn't have
idea.
responsibilities, right?
Yeah.
And I know for me that was really helpful to sort of have that. Okay, I'm off duty. I don't have to worry about stuff. I may get woken up, right?
Yeah.
And I may be needed, and that's fair game. But I know I can go into my bunk and I can go crash out for an hour or 2. And lots of times that extra hour of sleep, even in the middle of the day, is very helpful. And I always thought it was important to be well rested, because you never know when you have to be up for 7 or 8 hours, either because it's maybe you can't sleep. It's so rough you can't sleep, right? So I always wanted to have my sleep reserves kind of topped off as much as possible. And just because I just didn't want to be in a situation where I was sleep deprived, because you make bad decisions then.
Sure you do. No, I
Yeah.
think that makes perfect sense. And we did not have a day schedule. We would nap ad hoc and just sort of fell
Yes.
into a rhythm. But I definitely like your idea. I think that's something we would definitely use in the future. I always
Yeah.
think about these folks doing the Vendée Globe right now.
Jesus.
Sleep deprived there. I don't want to think how that feels.
I can't comprehend that, right? Because the one thing I wish I could change in my life is the amount of sleep I need. I wish I needed less.
Yeah. Well, sleep is healthy, so don't sell yourself short there.
Yes. Yeah. I've read some things recently that says that sleep is, we're learning that having sufficient sleep has greater health benefits than we thought in the past.
Absolutely. It totally does. Yeah.
Yeah. So interesting. So let me see. What else should we talk about that I haven't asked you yet?
Well, I think another aspect of these long distance cruises that might be interesting to listeners is how do you organize your life while you're at sea for 4 months?
Yes.
And, we learned a lot about that over these 2 seasons, one being 3 months long and one being 4 months long. One of the things is social connectivity. And I mentioned one of the motivators for our larger boat is to have a proper guest suite, private
Yes.
head and much more comfortable quarters, because we wanted to see our friends and family, and we wanted something appealing to offer to them in terms of accommodations and experience. So it's really important. But to our earlier point, not necessarily because you rely on them for crew, just because you want to have a few days. That said, the stays shouldn't be more. I'm watching a near miss car accident. Sorry. The stays should be limited in time. It's even a bigger boat. It's still a boat. It's not a massive mansion where people can get off on their own. So we found 2 to 3 days was a good
Perfect.
slice of time. Logistics, mail, big deal. We found a service where you can forward your mail and they'll scan the envelope and then optionally scan the contents and then either hold the mail or recycle it. That was really useful for us. Having some friends and network to kind of keep an eye on your land-based home, if you have
Yes.
one. Keep the plants watered or what have you. Those sorts of things really useful. Starlink, it was amazing, and we actually upgraded. We had the one where you can use it when you're stopped. This year we upgraded temporarily for the one where we could use it underway. Because when you're out at sea for long multi-day stints, it's important to stay connected and be able to take care of whatever business you may be responsible for. Yeah, those are some of the things. And, I'm a big proponent of, if you have the time to take the time, really slow down, enjoy, be selective about weather windows. Don't stress yourself out because you're on a tight schedule. Again, it's a luxury we don't always have, but when we have it, use it wisely. Makes a big difference in the quality of the experience. There's a lot to be said about, how, well, in our case as a couple, how do we approach that? It's a lot of time together, a lot of sort of, occasionally stressful moments, etc. And that's a topic that has no particular magic wand solution, but it's something that needs forethought and, a conversation at least, and perhaps agreement on certain rules of engagement. Have boat cards, meet all kinds of nice people out there, and it's nice to be able to exchange boat cards so you can stay in touch.
Yes. Yes.
And don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it. I mean, sailors are genuinely, for the most part, good people and anxious to help. We relied on others often just for advice or local knowledge. Local knowledge is better than cruising guides. I mean, you have to be careful and check the data. We all have the horrendous experience where someone tries to help you dock and they have no idea what line does what. And that was another one. Yeah, and be really kind. The people that help you, the dock hands and service people, they're really busy. They work hard. I think it's important to, take a moment, chat with them, be kind. A little tip or a gift is always appreciated. Those are some of the ones that come to mind, Bela.
Yeah. While you were talking about docking and coming into a strange marina, I have found that even sometimes dock hands may not know exactly what to do. So one of the things that I've started doing is when I'm coming in someplace, I will give the person explicit instructions on what to do. Like, take this line and put it around that cleat and
Oh, yeah.
keep me from going too far backwards or too far forward or drifting in this direction. Right.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think they find it helpful, right? Because lots
They
of times
do. They do. It's
your
absolutely the
boat.
right thing to do. You can always, as I've done many, many times, you can always apologize for barking orders afterwards.
Yes.
Then, well, as you slip them your $5 or $10 tip, you know,
Right.
you're fine with it.
And I do that in a nice way, but I just say, hey, what I'd like you to do
Well,
is
you're a
take this
better man
line.
than I am, because sometimes
Yeah.
under stress, I tend to be a little directive with dockhands.
And,
No,
and, I,
they're
and I
often-
find myself doing the same thing when I'm standing on the dock and someone throws me a line.
Yeah.
I
Somebody
ask the
else wants to
question, what would you like me to do with this?
Right. Good. Yeah, even though you probably know, it reassures
Right.
them that you're listening, and
Right.
No,
Yeah.
those are all great best practices. Good,
Yeah.
good thoughts.
It's taken me
Because
a
they're
number
often-
of years to figure that out.
Yeah. Well, they're often students doing it as a summer job.
Yes.
They're not necessarily professionals. And then you find
Yeah.
the one that's a professional who, insists on telling you you're doing it wrong.
Yes.
I find
And that's all.
the ones that can throw a line at a cleat that's 10 meters away and manage to have it tie a perfect cleat knot all by itself. Figure those guys are worth listening to. They've done it a few times.
That's right. Yeah, they sure have. They sure have. Hey, Dan, this has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you
Me
so
too.
much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a
Is
pleasure.
there anything else you wanted to bring up?
I think we covered a lot of ground, Bela. You're a very thorough interviewer, so I can't think of anything we didn't cover.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much. And
My
I
pleasure.
do
Thank
hope
you.
our paths cross again in the future at some time. It's been really great having you on the podcast.
Well, thanks. It's been very enjoyable for me, and I hope we get to sail together sometime.
That'd be wonderful. I'd enjoy that.
All right. Deal.
Take care, Dan.
Take care. Bye, Bela.
Yeah, cool interview, Bela. I really enjoyed Dan's perspectives on this. I mean, what an adventure kind of wrapped in this new boat purchase. It's not just like going down the street to the car dealer to buy a new car. It really was a very interesting process and a great story. What were your big takeaways from the conversation with Dan?
Well, Mike, it reminded me of how fortunate I was when we purchased our new boat, new to us, used boat. And it was 15 miles away from where we currently keep her. So for me to bring it from where I bought it to where the marina I'm keeping her at was a 15, well, it was a 3-hour trip, but it was just 15 miles. So, it wasn't like I was going out on the ocean for 4 or 5 days with a new to me boat. So it reminded me of how fortunate we were with that. And what happens to most people is when you buy a boat, a bigger boat, particularly that can't be trailered, or it's very expensive to trailer, what you're going to do is you're going to buy it and then you're going to get on it. You're going to sail it to your home port. And so it's a scenario that happens a fair amount. And so I think that, how you tackle that is sort of interesting. Because I know for me, I like to sort of understand how things work. And we've talked about these things a lot on this podcast about being sort of educated about what you're doing, knowing your boat, knowing how the systems work. These bigger boats are complicated. They're just as complicated as a house, if not more complicated, because you're floating on water and you got to keep the water out of the boat. So I think his approach was really, really good, where he sort of spent a month on the boat, just sort of learning the boat, taking it out for day sails, learning how the systems work, learning how it sails, and sort of getting comfortable with the handling of the boat. And then, we also talked a lot about sort of passage planning and sort of this notion of, okay, I'm going to move from point A to point B is my final destination, but along the way, I'm going to make these stops. And more importantly, if I'm going to do let's say 2-day trip, a 48-hour trip to go from one point to another point, and I'm going to do that out on the ocean, I always like to sort of think about where are the places that if something goes wrong, I can bail out. And where are my exits? It's sort of like you're on a limited access highway and you're driving across a state, and something happens and you want to get off and you want to go eat or whatever it is. Where are those exit points for me? Because even though the East Coast of the United States has a lot of exit points, that's one of the great things I love about it. There are stretches where the exit points, what I mean by exit points is moving from the ocean into a port, are not that frequent. And so kind of planning that out and knowing where those points are, I think is really important. And when you're doing a long trip, you got to think about provisioning. You got to think about food. You got to think about fuel. You got to think about water. You got to think about weather. Now, the nice thing about weather forecast is they're pretty darn good for today, tomorrow, and maybe the day after. So I tend to try to not go out for more than 2 or 3 days without having a nice place where I know I can hunker down if need be. And you know what that results in, Mike? That results in that I only sail in good weather because I decide to sail in good weather, and I can. I'm retired. I have the time. So those were a bunch of things that sort of Dan and I talked about. I think the biggest thing there for me was this notion of sort of spending a month on the boat, learning the boat before you go, not just sort of hopping on the boat and going. Now, of course, not everybody can do that. So sometimes you might have to. Now, another option, of course, is you can hire a delivery skipper to bring the boat to your home port. And, as I was thinking about this, I'm going, man, delivery skippers hop on strange boats all the time. And they do this for a living. And for me to do something like that, man, I'd really have to be a knowledgeable and have spent a lot of time on a lot of different boats for me to kind of bite that bullet and try something like that. But you can do it. How about you, Mike? What were the things that sort of stuck out at you?
Well, first, I love the backstory of this particular company that made this boat, right? Of the French, right? The owner of the company who lost his sight, and it's a really quirky. But I had to look it up. I didn't know anything about this. I think seeing the pictures of them, I saw them, but I wasn't in my conscious knowledge of sailing because I'm not a sailor. But the story is fascinating, and kind of the choices that led to are really interesting, and the challenges of moving from a more traditionally designed boat to something like this was kind of interesting to hear about. So I thought that was a really neat subplot. But in general, I thought it was so cool too that, okay, Dan's buying this boat and it's this big change, but he was really curious about exploring a new region. That, I mean, I definitely know from at least traveling on land that the Southeast U.S., the landscape is totally different than the Northeast. And I'm sure by boat, it's even more different. But I love the fact that it's this new experience of buying a boat, and he combined it with this really interesting kind of sightseeing and experiential trip to see the different landscapes. It kind of reminds me of when you would buy it's not so common anymore, but if you lived in the US and you bought a Mercedes or a BMW or a Porsche, you could get a discount if you picked it up at the German factory. So you could fly over and they'd give you a tour and they'd give you your car and you drive it all over Germany and learn kind of the Autobahn and the whole European landscape. And then you'd bring it back and they'd ship it over back to the US. And it kind of reminded me of this: is you buy this really cool car and you have this really cool experience all at the same time. So I just thought Dan's approach to this was really, an amazing experience. And I realized that not everybody is fortunate enough to have, as you said, the time and the money to kind of pull this off. But I love what he did in kind of designing this whole experience to pick his new boat up and learn about it and see a really cool part of the country all at the same time. Really cool.
Yeah, I think I think that's kind of intriguing, right? And you make a good point about combining multiple things into a trip, and it's a great way of doing it. And you can also attract other people to come along sometimes in those cases, right? And I thought his comment about sort of picking crew was sort of interesting. You know, it was fundamentally him and his wife made all of the long passages, all the trips, and then when he stopped someplace, they might invite some friends or family down for 3 or 4 days, but they just stayed local. But the longer stuff that they knew might be a little more stressful. You didn't want anyone getting seasick. You don't want, you know, that to be someone's first experience on the boat is this, you know, 2-day overnight passage. I thought that was really well thought out as well. So I think those were some great takeaways. What do you think? We should start wrapping this one up, Mike?
Sure. But I have one question for you, Bela.
Yeah.
Do you have any interest in, I mean, you're a primarily Northeast sailor. Do you have any interest in doing kind of a longer Southeast US trip at some point, maybe with your family when the grandkids are a bit older, or are you happy staying kind of around home base here?
I would love to take a trip down to Florida with the kids and the grandkids. That would just be great. A nice leisurely trip down. And even if it involves, you know, one set of kids and grandkids, you know, on the boat for a week, then we leave the boat someplace, come home, then go back down a week later with a different set or a different combination of family members and sail for a week. I would really, really enjoy that. I've done the trip from Florida up to Newport, and it's a great trip. That's really easy, wonderful things to see and explore. And the one time I did it, I really enjoyed it, and I would love to do that again.
Yeah, but if I remember correctly, you were helping a friend bring a boat up, right?
That's right. I was helping Simon and Sawyer bring their new boat, new to them boat up.
Yep.
So we sort of had a schedule, and we were on the move. So I would like to do a much more slower paced, leisurely trip.
All right, like what
I would
Dan
love
did.
to do that. Yeah, I would love to do
That'd
that.
be cool. And I have some friends, and they even did it where you'd take the boat down maybe with one set of kids, and then they fly back home, right? And then the other side of the family, right? The other son and the grandkids fly down, do another leg of the trip, and fly back. So you could even do it that way, and then you bring it home. But that something like that, I think it would be cool. I mean, right? While the kids are still, they have to be in that sweet spot, right? Old enough to be able to do it and to not, you know, kind of be comfortable with that, but not, you know. And then it gets to a point where they're flying the coop, right? And they don't want to do that because it's not cool to hang out with grandma and grandpa, you know, for a month. But,
That's right. That's right.
But that's really cool.
Yeah, the older ones are in that, they're approaching that sweet spot where they're independent enough that, you know, they're not going to get homesick, and they still like hanging out with grandma and grandpa. So.
And the cool thing is you got them working, which is great. I love how, you know, they do stuff on the boat, right? They help.
Yes.
It's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, kids love to do that kind of stuff, and that's the great thing, right? They don't just want to sit there and, you know, you got to keep them busy. So that's one of the great things about a sailboat, man. There's always something to do. So that's and I make things into games, and, you know, where were we navigating? Now we're looking for red buoy, you know, number 4. Where is it? You know, can you find it? That's where we got to go, blah, blah, blah. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, you always were a great teacher before you retired, Bela. And it's nice to see you're still using those teaching skills with the grandkids, and getting them to do hard work on the boat is awesome, right? Where they do stuff and they like it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the lessons I learned being a teacher have made me a better grandparent.
Love it. Love it. What do you think? Should we wrap this one up?
Yeah, sounds good, Mike.
All right, listeners, thanks for joining us for yet another episode. We hope you found our conversation with Dan Kerpelman interesting and thought-provoking like we did. And as always, if you have questions about what we've discussed, please get in touch with us. Our email is sailingtheeast, that's all one word, @gmail.com.
Hey, and finally, if you enjoy the podcast, please hit that like button on your app, and also write a review. When those things happen, we show up higher in the search hierarchy, and it makes it easier for other people to find the podcast. That's much appreciated. And if you know of someone that would be a good guest on the show, let us know. We'll invite them and see how it goes. So that's it for today's episode. Hope to see you out there soon on the water. So until next time, signing off from cold and upstate snowy New York. Take care.
And from over here in Musits, Germany, thanks for listening, and we'll see everybody next time.